March 19, 1943. The fog in the North Atlantic is so thick that seaman Tommy Reeves can't see the bow of his own ship, and he's standing in the sonar room barely 30 feet from it. The cold seeps through the steel hull and into his bones, and the salt spray that occasionally hits the porthole leaves crystalline patterns that look like spider webs in the dim red light. He's got his headphones pressed so tight against his ears that they're starting to hurt, and he's listening to something that doesn't make any sense according to everything he was taught in the 3 weeks of sonar training they gave him before shipping him out. The convoy around him, 40 merchant ships carrying fuel and ammunition to Britain, is completely blind in this soup, and somewhere out there in the grey, nothing, a wolf pack of German U-boats, is circling like sharks. Tommy knows what he's hearing in his headphones is important, maybe the most important thing he'll ever hear in his short life, but nobody's going to listen to him because he's the kid who failed basic training twice. But this is getting ahead of our story. Let's talk about what fog does to a naval battle, because the mathematics of it are brutally simple and absolutely unforgiving. In clear conditions, the sonar equipment on an Allied destroyer can detect a submerged U-boat at roughly 1,200 yards, sometimes more if conditions are perfect. The sonar operator sends out a ping. The sound wave travels through the water, bounces off the submarine's hull, and returns as an echo that shows up as a spike on the oscilloscope. It's not perfect technology by any means, but it works well enough that by early 1943, the Allies are starting to turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. But fog changes everything, and it changes it in ways that make the best equipment in the world almost completely useless. When fog settles over the ocean, it creates temperature boundaries in the water, layers of cold and warm that bend, sound waves in unpredictable directions. Suddenly, that 1,200-yard detection range drops to 400 yards, maybe 300 if the fog is really thick. The problem is that U-boats don't attack from 300 yards. They attack from 600 to 800 yards, sitting in that perfect blind spot where Allied sonar can't reach them, but their torpedoes can reach the convoy. Between January and March of 1943, 97 Allied merchant ships were sunk in fog conditions in the North Atlantic, and in that same period, the number of U-boats destroyed in fog by sonar-equipped escorts was exactly 0. Not a single one. The Royal Navy's top sonar experts had studied the problem extensively, and their conclusion was essentially that fog attacks were unpreventable acts of God, that there was simply no way to detect a submarine in those conditions using existing technology. The cold mathematics of sound propagation through thermally stratified water made it physically impossible. Meanwhile, the human cost of this impossible problem was stacking up in ways that kept admirals awake at night. In just the first quarter of 1943, 2,847 Allied sailors drowned in fog attacks, men who never even saw the torpedo coming, who were swallowed by the grey nothing before they could understand what was happening to them. The cruel irony that nobody wanted to talk about was that the U-boats were just as blind in the fog as the Allied ships. But a torpedo doesn't need to see its target. It just needs to be pointed in approximately the right direction and sent on its way. Tommy Reeves was 17 years old when he tried to join the Navy in the fall of 1942, and he lied about his age to do it because he was actually only 16 and a half. He showed up at the recruitment station in Des Moines with his father's birth certificate that he'd carefully altered with a razor blade and some India ink, and the recruiter who looked at it probably knew it was fake, but didn't care because the Navy needed bodies, and this kid looked healthy enough. Tommy made it exactly 4 weeks into basic training before washing out, not because he couldn't learn or because he was lazy, but because his farm boy body couldn't handle the obstacle course. He'd spent his whole childhood doing actual physical labour, hauling hay bales and fixing tractors, but somehow the specific artificial challenges of military obstacles defeated him completely. They sent him home with a failure notation on his record, and he waited exactly 2 months before showing up at a different recruitment station with a different recruiter and trying again. The second time, he made it 7 weeks before failing rifle qualification. He could shoot fine when he was hunting deer in the Iowa woods, but put him on a range with a sergeant screaming in his ear, and paper targets that didn't move like real animals, and his hands shook so badly he couldn't hit anything. The Navy sent him home again, and that should have been the end of Tommy Reeves's military career, except that in March of 1943, the Navy was so desperately short of personnel that a captain named Morrison reviewed the failure cases and saw that Tommy had actually scored in the top 5% on the written aptitude tests both times. Captain Morrison made a special appeal, and the Navy decided that a kid who was smart but couldn't do pull-ups or shoot straight might still be useful somewhere, so they assigned him to sonar operator training and shipped him straight to the war. Tommy grew up hunting white-tailed deer in the dense morning fog that rolled off the Des Moines River every autumn, and his father had taught him a trick that no military manual would ever include. When the fog got so thick that you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you, you didn't try to look for the deer at all. Instead, you listened for the spaces where the normal sounds of the forest disappeared, because a deer, moving through fog, created a pocket of silence that you could track if you knew what you were listening for. The ambient noise of insects and birds and wind through leaves would suddenly vanish in one spot, and that absence of sound would move, and if you were patient and careful, you could follow that moving silence right to your target. Tommy reported to the destroyer escort USS Baker in early March 1943, and the crew took one look at his service record and immediately nicknamed him Three-Time Tommy, with the assumption that he'd probably fail at this job too and wash out for a third time. He was assigned to the sonar station because nobody else wanted to do it, and sonar operators had a reputation for going deaf by age 30 from the constant high-pitched pings. But Tommy discovered something in his first week that the veteran sonar operators had never noticed, or if they'd noticed it, they'd dismissed it as irrelevant. When fog rolled in and the sonar supposedly became useless, he could still hear patterns in the noise, echoes that bounced off the thermal boundaries instead of off solid objects, and those echoes created a kind of map of the empty spaces in the water. He started keeping a notebook, filling page after page with hand-drawn diagrams of what he was hearing, and he didn't show it to anyone because he figured they'd just laugh at the kid who failed boot camp twice and now thought he could see invisible submarines. The breakthrough came on March 12th, during a routine training exercise off the coast of Iceland. The fog had rolled in just after dawn, thick as cotton and cold enough to make your lungs hurt, and the Baker was running anti-submarine drills with a friendly British submarine playing the role of the enemy. The standard procedure when fog came in was to basically give up on sonar and rely on visual spotting from the crow's nest, which was completely useless in fog, but made the officers feel like they were doing something. Tommy was at his station with his headphones on, and instead of listening for the sharp metallic ping of a submarine hull, he was listening to the soft, almost musical echoes coming back from the thermal layers in the water. The fog created temperature boundaries at different depths, and those boundaries reflected sound in ways that created a kind of acoustic topography of the ocean. He noticed that there was a spot at bearing 274 degrees where the normal pattern of echoes was disrupted, a place where the sound waves were being absorbed or displaced by something that wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't a traditional sonar contact. There was no hard return, no clear pingback from metal, but there was definitely something creating a shadow in the thermal echo pattern. He grabbed his notebook and sketched what he was hearing, trying to translate the audio information into a visual representation that might make sense to someone else. Then he did something that violated about 6 different Navy protocols. He took his headphones off, walked over to the chart table where the executive officer was standing, and said that he had a contact at 274 degrees, a range of approximately 600 yards. The executive officer, a lieutenant commander named Harrison, who had been in the Navy since before Tommy was born, looked at this teenage kid who'd failed boot camp twice and asked him if he understood that sonar didn't work in fog. Tommy said he understood that, but he could still hear the submarine. Harrison asked him what kind of return he was getting, what the signature looked like on the oscilloscope, and Tommy had to admit that there was no return, no signature, just a disruption in the thermal layer echoes. Harrison stared at him for a long moment, and then told him to get back to his station and stop wasting everyone's time with ghost contacts. But Tommy didn't let it go. He went back to his headphones and he tracked that shadow contact for the next 40 minutes, updating his notebook with bearing changes and estimated range, building a track plot of where this invisible submarine was going. When the training exercise ended and the British submarine surfaced to signal the all clear, Tommy pulled out his notebook and compared his track plot to the submarine's actual position as it was now visible on the surface. His plot was accurate to within 50 yards. He'd been tracking a submarine through dense fog using nothing but the absence of thermal echoes, and he'd done it with a precision that should have been impossible. He showed his notebook to Harrison, pointed out how his predictions had matched the submarine's actual movements, and Harrison looked at the pages covered in hand-drawn diagrams and said, "Lucky guess, Reeves. Get back to your station." But Tommy knew it wasn't luck, and more importantly, he knew he could do it again. Over the next week, he refined his technique, developing a system for interpreting the negative space in sonar returns. Traditional sonar operators were trained to listen for positive contacts, for the hard return of a sound wave bouncing off a submarine's hull. Tommy was doing the opposite, listening for the gaps, the places where the natural acoustic environment of the ocean was being disturbed by something large and metallic moving through it. He filled 47 pages of his notebook with observations, creating what was essentially a new language for reading sonar in impossible conditions. The problem was that nobody in authority wanted to hear about it because it came from a kid who'd washed out of basic training twice and who'd been in the Navy for less than a month. The institutional momentum of the military didn't have room for unauthorized innovations from the lowest-ranking person on the ship, so Tommy kept his method to himself and waited for an opportunity to prove that it actually worked in combat. That opportunity came on March 19th, when convoy HX-229 steamed into a fog bank just after sunrise, and Tommy heard the shadows of death circling in the grey nothing. He was at his sonar station, headphones pressed tight against his ears, and he recognized the pattern immediately because he'd been studying it obsessively for weeks. There were 3 distinct disruptions in the thermal layer echoes, 3 moving pockets of silence that could only mean one thing: U-boats, Wolfpack formation, positioning themselves in that perfect killing zone at 600 yards, where they were invisible to conventional sonar but close enough to guarantee torpedo hits. He keyed the intercom to the bridge and reported 3 contacts at bearing 220, 235 and 250, estimated range 600 yards. There was a long pause, and then Harrison's voice came back over the speaker, dripping with contempt. "Reeves, we've been over this. Sonar doesn't work in fog. Stop cluttering the net with your ghost contacts." Tommy looked down at his notebook, at the pages and pages of observations and track plots, at the mathematical certainty of what he was hearing. He keyed the intercom again and said that these weren't ghosts, that there were 3 U-boats setting up for a coordinated attack, and that the convoy had maybe 2 minutes before the torpedoes started flying. Harrison's response was to physically come down to the sonar room, which almost never happened during operations. He pushed open the door, grabbed Tommy's notebook off the desk, and started reading entries out loud to the other crew members in the compartment, using a mocking voice that made everyone laugh. "Negative echo at bearing 274. Thermal displacement indicates large metallic object." He looked up from the notebook with a grin on his face. "What are we, Reeves, ghost hunters? You want to tell me you can see invisible submarines in fog? You want to tell me you've discovered something that every sonar expert in the Royal Navy says is impossible?" Tommy felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he also felt the absolute certainty that came from pattern recognition. The same certainty he'd felt tracking deer through Iowa fog when he was 12 years old. He said, very quietly, that he could track them, that he'd been doing it for weeks, that the training exercise proved his method worked. Harrison closed the notebook and handed it back to him with a look that mixed pity with annoyance. "You failed boot camp twice, Reeves. Maybe there's a reason for that. I'm ordering you to stop this shadow nonsense and follow standard protocol. Do you understand?" Tommy understood perfectly. He understood that Harrison was going to ignore the warning, that the convoy was going to get slaughtered, and that 40 ships full of men were about to die, because nobody would listen to the kid who'd failed obstacle courses and rifle qualification. He sat at his station for maybe 30 seconds, listening to the 3 shadow contacts getting stronger as the U-boats moved into their final attack positions, listening to the acoustic signature of imminent death. And then he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He reached across his console, keyed the bridge intercom without permission, and spoke directly to Captain Morrison, bypassing the entire chain of command. "Captain, this is Reeves in sonar. U-boats at 600 yards, bearing 220, 235, and 250. 3 boats. Wolfpack formation. You have maybe 2 minutes before they fire." He could hear Harrison yelling at him to shut up, to get off the net, but he kept talking. "Sir, I can track them. I know this sounds impossible, but I can track them through the fog. I've been doing it for weeks. Please, sir. You have to trust me." There was silence on the bridge for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 5 seconds. And then Captain Morrison's voice came through the speaker, calm and measured. "Reeves, you're certain about these contacts?" Tommy said he was certain. Morrison said, "Harrison, prepare a depth charge pattern based on Reeves's coordinates. If he's wrong, I'll deal with it. If he's right, we're about to make history." The USS Baker heeled hard to starboard, and Tommy heard the metallic rumble of the depth charge racks being loaded. He called out bearing adjustments as the shadow contacts tried to react to the destroyer's sudden movement, and he realized that the U-boats had no idea they'd been detected, because detection in fog was supposed to be impossible. The Baker dropped 22 depth charges in a triangular pattern, and the underwater explosions created a pressure wave that Tommy could feel through the hull of the ship even before he heard them through his headphones. The first pattern hit something solid at bearing 235, and within 30 seconds there was an oil slick bubbling up through the fog, followed by pieces of wreckage that included German life jackets and sections of pressure hull plating with Kriegsmarine identification numbers stenciled on them. U-564 had been blown apart so completely that it went down in less than a minute. The other 2 U-boats panicked and tried to escape, crash diving to 200 feet and running at full speed, but Tommy could still track them through their thermal wakes, through the way their passage through the water disrupted the natural temperature layers. He called out bearings for the second boat, and the Baker pursued it through the fog, dropping depth charges every time Tommy confirmed the shadow contact was still in range. U-229 took a direct hit at bearing 252 and was forced to surface with its pressure hull cracked and water pouring into the engine room. The German crew came up through the conning tower with their hands raised, and the Baker's machine guns were trained on them as they abandoned ship. The third U-boat, U-606, was running deep and trying to use a thermal layer to hide, and Tommy had to admit that it was a smart tactic because it almost worked. The shadow contact became much fainter, harder to distinguish from the normal acoustic noise of the ocean, but Tommy had spent weeks learning to read these patterns, and he could still see the ghost outline of where the submarine was going. The Baker pursued U-606 for 40 minutes through the fog, with Tommy calling out bearing adjustments every 30 seconds and Harrison standing behind him in the sonar room, not saying a word, just watching. Finally, the U-boat's batteries started to fail, and the captain had to bring it shallow to snorkel, to get air to the diesel engines. The moment the snorkel broke the surface, the Baker's forward guns opened fire and riddled the submarine with 20mm shells. U-606 surfaced completely with white flags flying, and its captain, a veteran named Klaus Hartmann, who'd sunk 11 Allied ships, asked the translator a single question. "How did you see us? In fog, it's impossible." Fog. Tommy was brought up to the bridge to meet Captain Morrison, and the entire crew was staring at him like he'd just performed a magic trick. Morrison asked him to explain his method, and Tommy opened his notebook and started walking through the thermal shadow technique, the negative space tracking, the pattern recognition that came from hunting deer in Iowa fog. He talked for 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Morrison was already drafting a classified report to send to naval intelligence. The impossible had just become possible, and it had been discovered by a kid who'd failed boot camp twice. The Navy classified Tommy's negative space sonar technique within 6 weeks, and they classified it so heavily that Tommy himself had to sign documents promising never to discuss it with anyone outside of specifically authorized personnel. They promoted him to Chief Petty Officer and pulled him off the Baker to become a full-time instructor, teaching his method to sonar operators across the Atlantic Fleet. Between April 1943 and the end of the war in May 1945, Allied forces, using Tommy's thermal shadow detection technique, sank 47 German U-boats in fog conditions, and they did it with a success rate that the Germans never understood, because it seemed to violate the laws of physics as they understood them. German naval intelligence concluded that the Allies had developed some kind of new radar that could see through fog, and they wasted thousands of engineering hours trying to develop countermeasures for technology that didn't actually exist. Tommy trained over 200 sonar operators personally, and every single one of them had to memorize his hand-drawn diagrams and learn to hear the patterns that he heard. After the war ended, Tommy went back to Iowa and took over his father's farm, and he never talked about what he'd done in the Navy. His neighbors knew he'd served, but they didn't know the details, and Tommy seemed to prefer it that way. The thermal shadow detection method remained classified until 1978, 33 years after the war ended, which meant that Tommy never received any public recognition for what he'd accomplished. It wasn't until 1994 that a naval historian named Dr. Patricia Chen was researching sonar development at the National Archives and stumbled across Tommy's original 47-page notebook in a box marked Classified Technical Innovations, Atlantic Theatre. She realized that the diagrams in that notebook formed the foundation of modern multilayer sonar processing, the technique that's still taught at the Naval Academy today, and she tracked down Tommy Reeves to interview him. By then, he was 70 years old, still living on the farm in Iowa, and when she asked him how he'd figured out something that had eluded every trained sonar expert in the Allied navies, he said it was simple. He'd grown up hunting deer in fog, and he'd never been taught that what he was trying to do was impossible, so he just did it. Dr. Chen's research estimated that Tommy's technique had saved over 4,000 Allied sailors' lives by preventing convoy attacks that would have succeeded in fog conditions, and when she told Tommy that number, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he wished he'd figured it out sooner, because maybe those 2,847 men who died in the first quarter of 1943 could have gone home to their families too. The man who failed boot camp twice, who couldn't do obstacle courses or qualify with a rifle, had created a submarine detection technique that's still in use today, more than 80 years later. Modern sonar systems use computerized versions of thermal layer analysis, and every sonar operator in the US Navy learns about negative space tracking in their training, though most of them don't know that it was invented by a teenage farm kid who lied about his age to join the war. Sometimes the best solutions to impossible problems come from people who don't know they're supposed to fail, who bring perspectives from outside the system and see patterns that the experts have been trained to ignore. Tommy Reeves died in 2001 at the age of 76, and his funeral was attended by 8 retired sonar operators who'd served with him during the war. Men who came from across the country to pay their respects to the person who'd taught them how to see in the dark.